Well, welcome all to the fourth webinar in our AgForce winter series on sustainability in agriculture. I'm Annie Rutledge, Senior Policy Advisor at AgForce, and I'll be your facilitator tonight. Sustainability is at the core of our agricultural producers' success, often achieved under very challenging circumstances. Nevertheless, our producers lead the way in adopting new practices, and their adaptability is crucial to the success of our sector and why it continues to thrive. So in this webinar series, we've been fortunate enough to hear from subject matter experts across a huge range of fields, but all relevant to sustainability. Just please note that the information in these webinars is general. It's not a substitute for professional advice, and each farming business, region and context is unique. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Tonight's webinar will proceed with our speakers' presentations, followed by a Q&A session. You're welcome to pop your questions in the chat. Otherwise, just hold off to the end, please. All right, I'm going to throw now to Mark Collins. He's the chair of our Sustainability Committee at AgForce, and he'll give you a bit of an overview of AgForce and the committee. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Annie, and welcome all. For those of you who are guests of AgForce tonight, allow me to briefly introduce our organisation. AgForce is a peak organisation representing Queensland's cane, cattle, grain and sheep, wool and goat producers. AgForce provides advocacy to advance sustainable agribusinesses, and we strive to ensure the long-term growth, viability, competitiveness and profitability of our sector. Over 6,500 farmers, individuals and businesses provide support to AgForce through membership. We thank all those members present tonight for their ongoing support for our mission. Sustainability is among the key policy areas for advocacy at AgForce. We have a Sustainability Committee, which I chair, and Annie is the Secretariat. Our committee members own and manage cattle, sheep, cane and grain properties, and we're also fortunate to have members from our corporate partners. Together we meet to discuss and coordinate efforts around sustainability policy for agriculture. We have identified that there is a key need for continued education and informed dialogue, which is why we have convened these series. I'll pass back to Annie now so we can hear from our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So tonight we warmly welcome our guest speakers. We've got Su McCluskey, Special Representative for Australian Agriculture, and we've got Rebecca Underwood, Head of Sustainability at Nutrien Ag Solutions Australia. So Su, we're going to kick off with you. Could you introduce yourself, please, just before you kick into your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, AgForce, for inviting me to participate in this webinar, particularly around sustainability, which is really what is very much the core of what I do. So just a bit of an introduction for those of you who may not know what my role is. I'm the Special Representative for Australian Agriculture, which I guess you could describe as being like the trade ambassador or the trade envoy for Australian agriculture. It is a role that I'm the first person that's in. I'm 3 years now into the role, and effectively it's to be the voice for industry. So while I'm a ministerial appointment, I'm not a government employee. So I do represent and amplify the voice of industry in global markets, but I also share what I'm hearing back here in Australia. And very much the core of what I've been talking about is really around sustainability, and that has been very much the focus since I came into this role. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about what I'm hearing and what that means for Australian sustainability. I will touch on some of the areas that I think we need to focus on, and then Beck will actually go into some of the things that are happening on the ground. Thanks, Chris. So at the end of last year, I had a very busy 6 months where I spent it mostly overseas. I had a couple of trips to Europe. I was at COP 28 in Dubai. And so the first half of this year, I really focused very much on sharing what I was hearing domestically. So I was at Beef in Rocky, Hawk Connections. I spoke at the Meet Business Women's Conference. I participated in a whole lot of different round tables to be able to share what I was hearing. And what I was hearing was that not just was sustainability the absolute key to what we needed to be thinking about. But I was a bit concerned about the fact that we might have been falling behind the eight ball a bit, particularly when I looked at what some other countries were doing. And so very much my message was, we really need to get on the front foot here. We need to be thinking about what we're doing in terms of measurement and reporting, because that's what we're going to be asked to do. It's been interesting then in the last couple of months where I've actually been overseas. So firstly in Europe, Germany, Netherlands and Italy, and then Canada, and most recently in New Zealand. And I think that the tone has changed a bit, and I really feel we're at a time when the stars are aligning around Australia really being able to be on the front foot and take the lead. Thanks, Chris. So what I in my first trip overseas, what I really was seeing, and look, I first went to Germany where I spoke at a conference in Frankfurt. And the thing that always strikes me when I'm in Europe is the power of the NGOs and how really they've been able to capture the hearts and the minds of the politicians over there and be really influential. And this goes to social license, and I will come back to this. And it really does concern me. And I say it's something we just can't let happen here. But then we went to the Netherlands, and one of the trips that we went to, and when I say we, this was the first time we'd actually said, how do we actually share the love around my role? And the NFF came with us. So that's Tony Marr, the CEO of the NFF, and I at a farmer who, he was 34 years old with his partner. They were running a paddock to plate enterprise. They were they had a feedlot, and he was absolutely passionate about being a farmer and producing good beef. But because of Europe's Green Deal and Farm to Fork, he was effectively being pushed off the farm because the land and the way that agriculture contributes to emissions under the Green Deal and the way it's calculated meant that their policies are really saying they've got to reduce the beef cattle herd. So he was leasing the farm. He actually offered to buy the land off the farm owner, but the government came in and offered the owner far more money, and so he was not able to continue to farm. He actually said he's going to have to leave the Netherlands. So you can see that there are some very blunt instruments that are being used in other markets, such as the EU. And unfortunately, given the influence that the EU has on global rules and standards, we need to be very much aware of that, even though our closest and growing markets are going to be in Asia. I also, when I was in the Netherlands, had an opportunity to look at what some of the technology that's being employed, and we actually went to looking at the horticulture. So this was a fantastic facility that actually combined education for school kids along with the research and development, but also had a startup hub. So they were actually bringing the research, development and adoption together with the education, very much focused on horticulture. And when you look at the EU and you think about how this interacts with what this cattle farmer was doing, in an EU sense, they say they're not concerned about food security. They have enough food to feed Europe. The Netherlands are just going to get their beef from Germany or France. This farmer is going to leave. He'll go and farm somewhere else. But we've actually got to be very much aware of the influence that these policies do have on the way that we're heading, particularly when it comes to sustainability. Thanks, Chris. My next trip then was to Canada, and I was really interested in Canada because Canada for me is a country where I don't have to explain the size of a farm property. I don't have to explain the size of herd. We're very like-minded. I had the opportunity to go out on a ranch. I had some great conversations with the farmer there. What I hadn't realised though, because I thought, you know, same size land mass virtually, same sort of size population, was that really Canada, it's probably only a third, if that, maybe only a quarter that they can actually farm, because the rest of the country is basically under ice. It's Arctic. And even at Calgary, and that's where I went to this property, we were there in a heat wave. So it was 34 degrees when I was there at the feedlot. They spend 8 months of the year basically in winter. They get down to -48. In that feedlot, they were having to put straw out every day just to be able to provide bedding. So there were some things that I realised where I thought, well, we're very much like-minded, but there were some core differences. I think the combination of the cold, the fact that they do need to shed their livestock for a large part of the year, and the fact that they need to feed, is methane is not their biggest issue. It's actually nitrogen. And that is because they have such a short growing season, they do need to use a lot of nitrogen fertilisers. The other thing I had the opportunity to do when I was in Canada was go out and speak to the Nutrien team, who are based in Calgary globally over there, and just talk to their sustainability team about what's happening in Canada around sustainability, but they also talked to me about the US and, of course, what's happening here in Australia, which Beck's going to cover. But it was really interesting to be able to see where some of those differences was and how you actually need to adapt sustainability practices for what really is the way that you farm. I also had the opportunity to meet with a number of different farming groups and politicians over in Calgary. There was a great interest in my role. I think Canada will really be gunning for having a role equivalent to mine, which I think is a great thing to have that industry voice. But what I did sense in Canada was very much that they're anticipating a change of government at their next election. They're not sure what that's going to mean. They're looking over the border to what may happen in the US should Trump come in, what that means in terms of climate change, what it means in terms of sustainability. And so I just felt that there was a bit of uncertainty around the way, particularly from a government level, they were looking to respond in terms of policies. From a farmer perspective and a community perspective, there were a couple of things that struck me. One is there's an absolute embracement of agriculture as being core business across Canada. So there was a strong link between the community and consumers and where their food comes from, and the importance of farmers and agriculture. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and people over there thought it was strange that I even called it out, was the number of young people, and particularly young women in leadership roles. So I actually got to go to the Calgary Stampede. Now, you would think that normally, we think that'd be a pretty blokey sort of thing, but the women that were involved, not just in competing, but commentating, not just at the rodeo, but at other competitive events around the Stampede. But there were young women, and in fact, this rancher's daughter, who was only in her 20s, was the vice president of the cattle committee at the Calgary Stampede. So I thought that was just brilliant in terms of the way they are really embracing young people coming into agriculture, bringing them into leadership positions, and they don't even question when it comes to age or gender. It's just about what you can contribute. Thanks, Chris. My next trip then was, and this was quite recent, was to New Zealand. Now, New Zealand was very interesting. I spoke at the red meat sector conference, and if I thought that Canada was in a bit of a state where they were watching and waiting, I felt New Zealand was very much despondent. And it was a bit sad to see, because when I was there a couple of years ago, they were very gung-ho in terms of their sustainability measures. They'd gone out hard and fast on their carbon measurements, their emission measurements. They had a program called He Waka Eka Noa, and that was very much focused on measurement and reporting. They proudly said, know your number. And the government at the time had actually said, and if you don't do this, we're going to be introducing a methane tax. I talked to a number of peak bodies over there, and I said, how have you got farmers to do this? Because it's a big compliance burden. If we tried to introduce this in Australia, we would get a lot of pushback. And I was trying to learn, but for New Zealand, when you think about it, they have a large export focus that is primarily around agriculture, and within that is mostly dairy. So for them, it was a really important thing in terms of market access about going out hard and fast. 2 years down the track, there's been a change of government. He Waka Eka Noa has been abolished, and industry sectors are saying, we don't know what we're supposed to do now. They had 13 different calculators. They are trying to bring that down to 9. They don't have consistency in terms of measurement and reporting, and they're not sure what the government's going to do now in terms of the next step. So they were really interested when I talked about the processes we're putting into place, about what we're doing around thinking about having consistency, common methodologies. And they actually said to me, can you come and talk to our politicians? And that's me with the Prime Minister, although I didn't quite get to, bend his ear as much as I might have liked to. But they said, we need help and we're looking to Australia because we need to know how we go to the next step. So that was really interesting in seeing how things can change so quickly. Thanks, Chris. So I've really moved in terms of where I'm saying the international perceptions of Australian agriculture are. 12 months ago, I was saying that our reputation as a producer of clean, safe, green and high quality products has been eroded. I'm now saying we need to work hard to retain it. There are countries that have actually looked to us. New Zealand has always been there, having that clean, green reputation, but Ireland has really done a lot of work in this area and is doing great things over in Europe. For trade and market access, critically, we need to demonstrate sustainability credentials, and that's going to become more and more important. Social license is critical. And I said that at the start. I get really concerned about what I see in Europe and the power of the NGOs and their power to influence. But it's something we've really got to work on and work with connection with community. But where I've got to now, particularly after these last 3 trips, is firmly believing Australian agriculture can lead the way, and we can lead it in so many different ways. Thanks, Chris. So first of all, and, I'm not going to apologise for the next slide because the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework is something that I talk up right around the world whenever I put this slide up and talk about how it articulates Australian agriculture's overall articulation of what we're doing around sustainability. There are 17 principles. It fits with the ESG, which is the language of the corporates. It meets the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the language globally. People go, wow, we don't have anything like this. And at a recent workshop in Washington, countries around the world were saying, we've done different things at the industry level, but we don't have anything that's strategic and overarching. Canada actually wants to work with us on developing their own sustainability framework. We've got other countries that are saying this actually provides a model. And I'm actually saying this is our stake in the ground. This is our linchpin upon what else sits around it. And we can fit other things within the sustainability framework. Thanks, Chris. So, of course, we do know that under the Australian Sustainability Framework, we have individual industry sector frameworks. I probably know the beef sustainability framework the best, given that I'm a beef cattle farmer myself, but there's a sheep sustainability framework, there's the grains, the dairy, all the sectors now have sustainability frameworks, but we've also got other things. So we've got smart cane in Queensland, the smart cane BMP, and we've got ag care, and I'm going to come back to ag care. The important thing is, and this actually goes back to what I say globally about there's no one size fits all, is the beauty of that overarching AASF is it allows the individual frameworks, BMPs, programs to be fit for purpose for their particular industry. But in the end, they do feed up into that overarching framework, and collectively we meet all of what we need to do around ESG and all of what we need to do around the SDGs. Thanks, Chris. So there's a lot of work that's being done at the moment around measurement and reporting. We've still got more work to do around data. And once again, I'll come back to that. We do have the Australian carbon credit units. So we have a marketplace now, and early in the stage, but we have a marketplace there that's providing incentive to farmers to be able to do this. We then got the legislation, so the climate-related financial disclosures, and that is what is really putting the pressure really on the corporates to say we need to be collecting the information because we need to report it. They report their scope 1, which is what's happening at the moment. But for those agribusinesses in the supply chain, in the next few years, they'll be looking at how they report their scope 3, and scope 3 is what farmers will generate. So there's very much a great interest now in what's happening on farm, and how do we actually get farmers to be able to understand what their emissions are, what their carbon footprint is, and then how do we actually measure and report that. But then we have coming over the horizon the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which will then translate into legislation. So that will be the next overlay. And there's been a lot of work that's been done around natural capital. And natural capital is really the next stage. So we're focusing very much on carbon and emissions at the moment, but that's only the first tranche of this. We then will look at natural capital. And natural capital, once again, we shouldn't be scared about this, because in Australia, we've been doing great things for decades around biodiversity, around soil health, around water management. So there's a lot that we're already doing on farm. And remember that our farmers aren't subsidised. So we know we need to look after the land for it to be there for the next generation. And all of this actually plays well into what we've already been doing for many, many years. We've just got to capture it. So programs such as you have with AgCare are really important tools and mechanisms to be able to look at how you can value your biodiversity, value your natural capital, because we are moving towards the stage where the value will be translated into dollar values that will become an asset for you, that you can then look at trading, you can then look at being able to get loans against, and very much the financial market will come in. And of course, in the end, this has got to translate to a value proposition for farmers. And if there's not money in for it, well, we're not going to be doing it, are we? Thanks, Chris. The next piece of work that's going on at the same time is the government's climate statement, and there are 6 different sector plans under this, of which agriculture is one of them. Interestingly, you know, I've been banging on for a long time that how come other portfolios don't get the importance of agriculture to climate change, to water, to the environment, when it comes to waste, when it comes to land use. The message is starting to get through, because when you think of agriculture and you think of energy and you think of transport and you think of households and you think of waste and land use change and forestry, agriculture actually goes across all of those areas. So we're starting to see more of an intersection between that. And there was recently a summit held in Toowoomba and that had both the previous agriculture minister and the climate change minister there, but we had a whole lot of people in the room to actually say, how is this going to work in practice? Thanks, Chris. So importantly, I am now very much of the view that Australian farmers really are world leaders in sustainable agriculture. That's not taking away from the work that we still need to do. But what we've got to get better at doing is we've got to get better at telling our story. We've done a lot in terms of the evidence and science. And, you know, I was actually at a university this morning at the ANU looking at the Agri-Food Innovation Institute and the great tech that they're doing. But we're not always getting that information out, but we've got to think about how we actually tell the story so we connect with communities and we connect with consumers. I'm actually seeing a real coming together and collaboration right the way along the supply chain, where I've got the corporates along that supply chain actually saying, we need to be all in this together. This is a shared responsibility. This isn't just about the farmer bearing the cost. If we can actually share that and we can look at ways that we can harness data, we can share data, then this actually alleviates the load for the farmer themselves. And then we got to think about the opportunities where we can really talk about Team Australia and Brand Australia. And Australia's actually made a bid for COP31 in a couple of years' time. We won't know if we've got that until the end of this year, probably. But COP29 this year is in Azerbaijan. If we do get the COP31 to be in Australia and it will be with the Pacific, that's a wonderful opportunity to really be able to showcase the great things we're doing in Australian agriculture. Thanks, Chris. So where to now? Well, we've got a lot more work to do on sustainability, and that's both at the strategic and operational level. But what I'm seeing happening is really moving us very much towards that. And the private sector is way out in front of where government is. So really government needs to look at letting the market operate, but then seeing where the gaps are. And then how do you actually provide the incentives or other mechanisms so we actually get everyone understanding they need to be part of it. There's a lot more work we need to do around data, but also around how we can actually harvest data that's there. So we're not asking farmers to have to go out and do all the work around collection and add to the compliance burden they already have, so that we can actually get that and then report it. Always opportunities for greater collaboration and working together, and that's at the university level, at the RDC level, at the industry level, and between government and industry and the supply chain. The co-design process that we're seeing in the ag and land sector is a really great opportunity, and telling our story, because the consumers and the community are the ones that really are going to impact the social impact. So it's how we tell that story about the great things we're doing. And we've actually got to get mainstream. We've actually got to talk to the majority of people who actually understand they know they need to eat safe, healthy, fresh food, but they don't always connect with where it comes from. Thanks, Chris. And look, I'll end with just a quote from a Queensland farmer, Nigel Corish. And, I talked to him about sustainability, and he talks a lot about sustainability. And it's people like Nigel that really we have to get to help us tell the story. And he just says, sustainability isn't something different on you. It's just about doing things well. And it's, and really, as I said earlier, it's about what farmers have been doing for decades. Technology has come into it. It's helped with what we need to do in the future. But in the end, it makes good sense. So thank you. I'll finish there and I'll pass over to Beck.
Great, thanks, Sue. I've heard you present a couple of times, but I still get things out of it every time I hear. So thank you for that. I think that leads nicely into what I'm going to talk about, which is more of, I guess, what we're practically doing on farm. So I think Sue set it up nicely from a big picture point of view. But firstly, just to introduce myself, Rebecca Underwood is my name, based in Albury, New South Wales. A farming background, and I used to be an agronomist. I do often joke that I wouldn't pay me as one anymore because I don't think I'd earn a living being an agronomist. But yeah, working now in the sustainability team for Nutrien. So I'm just going to give you a really broad overview today of what we're working on. 20 minutes is not going to cover everything by any means, but broad overview, and then we can, if anyone's interested, we can certainly connect to give you some more information. So I guess, firstly, why does Nutrien have a sustainability team? And I guess 2 years ago, the business saw that this was coming at farmers. And when I say this, meaning sustainability, demonstrating your sustainability credentials would be really important moving forward. So we have a team, and how that team is structured, we have field managers. Charles Starkings is on the call here today, and he's the Queensland and New South Wales field manager. Had field officers under the field managers, and they're really working with our network of advisors and farmers to work practically and what we can do on farm to improve our sustainability credentials. Then we also have a couple of other key roles, one being a sustainable markets manager. And his role is really to talk to the supply chain and to understand what their sustainability commitments are and how they're potentially going to impact how they interact with farmers in the future. So I think it's a really critical role. And we see our role, I guess, as helping producers to produce products that meet, a market specification. And without understanding how they're going to, how their commitments might impact that, we really are flying a little blind. So he's in a really important role in our team. And then obviously a lot of the work with field managers is really working with growers to understand their emissions on farm. So I am going to focus mainly on emissions in this next 15-20 minutes, but we are working on sort of 5 pillars. One is emissions, and that's 90% of the work we do, I'll be honest. But we're also looking at 4 other pillars, being soil health, animal health and welfare, biodiversity and water management. And we haven't come up with that just, off the cuff. It's probably what the supply chain are interested in those things. And like Sue just mentioned, we're already doing some great work as farmers in those areas. But yeah, the supply chain seems to be really focused on those 5 areas. So I'll just share this presentation. And Annie, you might be able to tell me if that is in presentation mode. I'll assume it is, unless someone tells me otherwise.
Sorry, Beck,
Okay.
I was struggling to find the unmute myself button. No, it's
you're
looking
right.
good. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. No worries. So look, short and sharp today. We're just going to through. So Sue sort of set the big picture stage at a global level. Just going to go through a bit of what we're hearing in the market in Australia, and then really, I guess what our focus is on the productivity piece. And we're certainly not saying that farmers aren't already productive. Farmers are very productive, very sustainable, need to be to farm in Australia. But it's what can we tweak, and what are those things that we need to tweak, and what is the data we need to capture to demonstrate that. And then thirdly, just going through farm emissions profiling and how that can impact a business or help a business. So again, this is just from our, this is what we see as some of the pressure that could mount on farmers. And I don't want to say be alarmist when I say that, but I think everyone understands that there is pressure mounting in this space. So obviously the Paris Agreement, and that is really fueling that the 43% reduction target that the government has. And so that's from a government level. Then we're seeing a lot of these big players in the supply chain, some of which we're working with, but big players in the supply chain that have science-based targets. And then further to that, Sue also mentioned the mandatory reporting that's coming out in Australia. So that farm level data and understanding, emissions on farm is really going to be critical to some of these big players. And then the third pillar is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So all the major players in the banking sector in Australia have signed up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is really looking for net zero emissions from their lending portfolio by 2050. So there's a fair bit of pressure coming there as well. So just really briefly, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I guess the last 2 years we've spent a lot of time understanding where the emissions are on farm. How do we report on that as accurately as possible, given the tools we have at the moment? And then, and also, what are the levers that we can actually pull to reduce those emissions? So at a beef, and I don't want to spend too much time because a lot of people may already understand this. But for a beef cattle farm, we're looking at scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And for those that don't understand scope 1, 2 and 3, briefly, scope 1 is basically any emissions on farm that you can control, or that are a result from from your direct actions on farm. Scope 2 is electricity or purchased electricity. And scope 3 are any emissions that are outside of your control, upstream or downstream. So in the case of a beef production system, any inputs that you buy, fertilizer, pesticides on farm, and when you purchase livestock onto the farm, it's classed as a scope 3 emission. So we're doing a lot of work there and really understanding this key metric, emissions intensity. And that's what the supply chain, or anyone we've spoken to in the supply chain, really seems to be interested in, is this metric. And that really is, I guess, the output of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of, in this case, live weight, in a cropping sense, per kilo of grain. So that really is the measure, and how they can sort of benchmark growers from an emissions point of view is looking at this emissions intensity, or EI. So that, I think that's going to be a really important metric moving forward. This is just some of the work we're doing. Again, like I said, not going to spend a heap of time on this, but happy to go through this with people individually. We're really focused on productivity. Like I said, supply chain, some pressures mounting, but at the moment we aren't actually seeing that that sort of be realised in a premium or in a market access issue. We think that could all be on the cards down the track. So we're really looking at, well, how do we improve our productivity and also demonstrate our improvement in sustainability at the same time? So that's what we're really focused on in the work that we're doing. So this is just some of the work we've done. On the left, I've just got an example where we've worked with a grower, and this is real data. We work with a grower. We got an emissions intensity on his beef cattle production, and had a calving percentage of 68%. So then we said, right, well, we'll run some scenario analysis, and if he'd changed nothing else in his system, what would an improved calving percentage do to his emissions intensity? And you can see that both in the graph and in the table, that by increasing the calving percentage to 74%, he did actually decrease his emissions intensity from about 17 to under 16. So all that makes a significant difference in this situation. And then you can layer other things like getting the cow to slaughter quicker. And this is what's on the right-hand side, is making sure that we get that cow to a cell weight. In this case, it's 510 kilos. Getting it to a cell weight quicker actually reduces the emissions intensity. So this isn't based on live data, this one, but this is just some modelling that we've done. And yeah, so getting that, cutting the head off the animal, I guess, quicker and making sure that we're getting to that growth rate quicker is really critical. So I guess this is the advice that we give to our growers at the moment. And our growers, a lot of our growers are working with some sort of consultant on farm or an animal production specialist. And really, I guess it's these 4 key things is what we're saying, from reducing the emissions intensity of your livestock production. And that is around, utilising genetics, and that is a slower burn, admittedly. Improving reproductive performance, so, that calving rate that we just looked at. Optimising the animal nutrition and feed efficiency, getting that animal up to slaughter weight quicker, and really planning the management of feed transition to avoid those setbacks, in periods of lower feed availability. Just touching on cropping, again, I won't go into too much detail, but just looking at the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions of a crop production system. And this is not, like, I guess you could say this is typical, but each individual system will change. So in your scope 1, you're going to have a big proportion of your emissions coming from fertiliser use, so nitrous oxide loss in the fertiliser system. And also crop residues and indirect nitrous oxide loss from deposition and leaching. You also have fuel in your scope 1. And then in your scope 3, if fertiliser does have, and we are an input supplier of fertiliser does have a very big embedded emission. So nitrogen fertiliser has a very high embedded emission. So before you even get it on farm, there is some pretty high emissions in that product. So that's where you're seeing the emissions in a cropping system. So what's the advice we're giving to growers? As you saw, most of the emissions on farm are coming from fertiliser in a cropping system, and it really is about nitrogen use efficiency. So if you're using that nitrogen more efficiently, you are generally getting a lower EI, so a lower emissions intensity. And that has been reflected in all the work that we've done across different commodities, be it cotton, cane, canola, etc. Canola is probably not really relevant for the Queensland group, but it certainly has been the case across all of the work that we've done. The better NUE, the lower emissions intensity. And then practically, there's a lot of ways that you can look at how do you improve your nitrogen use efficiency. So some of it is just, the old 4R principles: right rate, right place, right source, and right time. And I think a lot of growers are already doing that really well, but just seeing if there's anything in there that you can tweak. Incorporating legumes and cover crops, managing your soil health and managing soil constraints. And that is something that we're really starting to focus on now, is soil health and soil constraints with our customers in a sustainability context. And then looking at products, enhanced efficiency fertiliser products. So looking at urease or nitrification inhibitors, so coatings on the fertiliser which reduce either ammonia or nitrous oxide loss depending on the product. And there is some products coming out now, biological nitrogen products that you apply to a non-leguminous crop that actually can sequester nitrogen. Early days for some of those products, but they are showing some promise. So so that's certainly another option or another tool in the toolkit. So I guess, this is how we're approaching it. Just to, I've got a last few slides to wrap it up, but really how we're approaching it is education. And I say that, and I'm certainly not being condescending. I think before I entered into the sustainability team, I was pretty confused by this space. Every second article is on sustainability in some of the newsreels, and some of them are very giving conflicting messages. So, to be honest, I don't blame people for being confused in this space. So we're rolling out some education to a lot of our growers and our farm advisors to make sure that we've got the right information going to our grower customers. So we do think that's a pretty critical piece of the puzzle. Then we're going into the measurements. So farm emissions profile is what we're calling it. Other people call it a carbon account or a carbon baseline. We don't call it a baseline because that sort of says that it sets the starting point, whereas this is pretty fluid. So we're calling it a farm emissions profile. And then looking at, well, solutions. What makes sense now from a commercial point of view? What makes sense from a productivity point of view? And then as opportunities, market access issues come to the forefront in this space, then how do we look at solutions to reduce emissions in this case or improve sustainability metrics? So yeah, farm emissions profile. So this is, like I said, the bulk of the work that we've been doing with our customers. Really, some of the feedback that we've had from growers is, and a lot of the growers that we have been working with are probably, at the forefront and what I would call pretty good, efficient growers. And we have emissions ranges per commodity. So for beef cattle, for instance, your emissions range should be somewhere in the order of 11 to 18 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilo of live weight. And really, it's sort of a benchmarking metric. You can have a look at it to say, well, if I'm at the higher end of that range, why? And is there something in my system that I can tweak? So it really is a really good view on production efficiency, the EI or the emissions intensity. So the farm emissions report gives you overall emissions for your farm and then the emissions intensity of each commodity. And we have had really good feedback from growers that have been participating in that service. So, yep, Charles, he's on the call, and I think this same picture is on his profile picture, but he's our contact. He's the main contact for Queensland for this audience, and you can scan that QR code and you can get some more information off our website. And yeah, look, just it's probably a shameless plug, but we have done some work with growers and they've really got a lot out of doing the work because it's not only about knowing your number, that's really important, but it's also about knowing what to do once you have your number. What can you start to tweak in that system? How do you get advice around that? So I guess that's the work that we're doing broadly, but really happy to talk to anyone one-on-one. And when I say that's probably Charles in particular that you can contact because he's the expert for Queensland, you can contact and learn more about the work that we're doing or some of the data that we've already collected. So Annie, I'll wrap up there and hand back to you. I'll just stop sharing.
Oh, thanks, Beck. That was absolutely terrific. I feel really fortunate that we've got to hear from both of you tonight. You've taken us on a journey from international back to the farm scale, and there's a lot of reason for optimism, but obviously there's a bit of a communication challenge ahead for us. All right, so that brings us to question time. I'll ask Mark to kick us off with a question, and then we can take any further questions from the audience.
So I've got a question for you regarding how this plays out with trade. We're seeing EU regulations on us, and they're just not fit for purpose here in Australia. It's a case of ISCC, I think it's called, rules for grain, canola in particular. Deforestation probably fits into that category as well. And I just get the feeling we're being picked off a bit. What strategies can we do to help that?
Thanks, Mark. Look, there's a number of strategies we've got to put in place. And like we say, there's no one size fits all. There's no one strategy that, we can rely on. At the government level, certainly agitating through the WTO and through the Cairns group is one way. I call the WTO a slow burn. but we can't let go of that. I'm quite vocal, and I guess in my role I can be as blunt as I'm able to be, and I am in global markets and here, and I push back very strongly on the EU, and I call them out for greenwashing when they try to say that they've, changed their subsidies, their cap to be more environmentally focused. They're not backing that up. They don't have the data, the measurement and the reporting that we're doing. Now, of course, we walked away from the last EU FTA. We will go back and have another go at it. But in the meantime, I think if we've got the ability to come up with data and measurement, so we can actually say to them, well, this is how we can prove that we're actually meeting those same outcomes. We're just doing it in a different way. Then they're going to have to argue back with us. Now, of course, that's only one market. It's an influential market. I think the other reason we need to do this is when we look at our market access into other countries, and let me look at Asia, for example, which is really, as I said, a huge market opportunity for us, whether that be India, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and others, that they are open to looking at what may impact in terms of market access. What we don't want them to do is be influenced by the EU way of doing things, so they then start to lock us out. And so that's something where, and I'll be in Southeast Asia in another month, but it's very much around that relationship building, letting them know what we're doing around sustainability and what we're doing around the really good things. We have a good reputation in Asia, but we don't want that to be taken backwards because of what the EU may be doing. So there's a lot of moving parts in this, and I think we've got to look at a number of different ways. You mentioned EUDR. EUDR's something that I've got quite vocal about. On a government level, Australia has pushed for a delay in the application. I talked to Canada about this. I talked to New Zealand about this. I think we do need to get industry fired up and being quite vocal. When I was in Rome, I talked to Tony about seeing if we can get this on the agenda for the WFO. Talking to the EU representative in New Zealand, and I've been following this up through our Brussels people, it's going to be very hard for them to put this into place on 1 January because they're just not ready. And, when I met with the Dutch Farmers Organisation, they said, look, they don't support it, but of course they're carved out. I think we've just got to keep agitating, but we've actually got to be able to demonstrate why this is a problem for us. So, for example, on my farm, I have tea tree. Tea tree is a pest. If I try to clear some of that tea tree, it's clearing of woody weeds, it's in breach of EUDR. And, so that doesn't make sense. So we've got to make sure we come up with practical examples to say, hang on, the way you're mapping this, there's challenges around geolocation, but we've then got to be able to offer the alternative, which I think work is being done around now. So there's a lot of work to do in this area, Mark. It's not simple. Some of it's going to take longer. But for all of us who are passionate about this, we're just going to stay on the bandwagon.
Yep. Thank you.
So I'll ask a question if I may, and then I've got one for Becca as well. So we often think, well, we know the good work you're doing. We wonder, we'd love to hear a bit more about what's happening with DFAT and how the message that you project is being, amplified by others, I suppose, who should be overseas, singing to the same hymn sheet and telling the good news of Australian agriculture and defending us against those unjustified sort of claims. Are you able to make a comment on that to either reassure us or suggest areas for where we might lobby?
So once again, a couple of responses there. I actually think this is a whole of government response, and I have actually been, and I'm starting to get a bit more vocal about how this does need to be a whole of government response, and the whole of government needs to understand the importance of agriculture that sits under all of those portfolios. It's been a bit challenging with DQ, which is the Climate Change, Environment and Water portfolio. And when I came back from COP last year, I said, why does Australia not get the importance of agriculture to climate change when every other country in the world does? And so I've been very vocal about that. DFAT's role is very much within our trade negotiations, which is something I don't get directly involved with. But I have to say, when I'm in country, quite often I will have a DFAT person there. And they will actually deal with, as will our agricultural councillors in DAF who are in country, deal with some of those specific bilateral issues. But on a broader scale, I certainly will have involvement. I think the other aspect of this is, and I've sort of been campaigning this for the last 12 months, is there's only one of me, and we've got to share the love. So I've been actually, looking at who else is in country. It was one of the reasons why the NFF came to Europe with us, so we actually can say, well, this isn't just coming from one person, this is coming from others. I've talked to Nuffield scholars to be able to say, look, you spend time around the world, how can we get the messaging to you so that you can actually be sharing these messages? And I think we've got to be able to tap into when other representatives of Australian agriculture, and that's both at the industry level and the government level, are in country and can give these messages. So we're actually being quite consistent. So I think we're still working on that. But one of the things I think your question has actually raised with me is, do we actually need to get, some sort of cheat sheet, key talking points that we can actually share more broadly, so that we can actually let people know that these are the simple messages that we need to be giving and giving consistently. So thank you for that.
Oh, no, thank you, Sue. Rebecca, I was interested to, I've heard your message a few times around efficiencies. I'm thinking in the cropping context, people, obviously would love to apply less expensive fertilizer. What new innovations or sort of ways forward are there for people to, I guess, target the nutrient needs to the crops in a different way than they have been?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the starting point, to be honest, but we've done a lot of work on variable rate technology. So where people haven't been using variable rate and then they use variable rate, what does that mean for productivity and also from an emissions intensity point of view? And layering that up with things like a nitrification inhibitor or a urease inhibitor, depending on the circumstance, because they do work in different ways. So layering some of that technology up, looking at legumes in the rotation and some of the work that we've done, and obviously it has been in canola, so not as relevant to this group, but it would still be relevant in any cropping context. Having a legume in the system prior can really reduce the emissions intensity due to the reduction in nitrogen needed for that crop in that next year of the rotation. So it's probably not a one size fits all, but there's plenty of technology out there that's currently available for nitrogen. I think the big question I get asked, and I won't shy away from it, is when is a low carbon intensity fertilizer product coming to market? And we do get asked that because we are a global fertilizer manufacturer. And I guess the answer on that is, I guess, when the market signals that they are willing to pay for that. So at the moment, it can be, the numbers being touted are pretty expensive to have, really low carbon intensity fertilizer. And so far, the market signals haven't been there to make that investment for lots of companies, not just Nutrien. So I think that's also another one, and that's probably, like I said, looking at the Scope 3 emissions on fertilizer, it already comes urea-based or nitrogen-based fertilizer comes with a high embedded emissions. I guess that's the holy grail, but we do need those market mechanisms there.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Well, I could probably keep on asking questions, but I feel like I need to encourage others to do so. But we seem to have a shy audience tonight.
So Annie,
Sue or
yeah,
oh
so
yes.
while they're thinking about it, just a couple of comments. I'll just pick up on what Beck has said. So on the fertilizers, it was interesting when I was in Ottawa and went to the Smart Farm there. Some of the work they're doing around nitrogen inhibitors, so the coating, but also the impact on yields. And, you know, I heard an interesting thing, as you would have heard yesterday, at the summit we were both at, where someone said you don't go into the red to just be green. And so if your yields are going to fall and this is going to cost you a lot more, you're just not going to do it. So I think that, you know, in the research area, there's still more work to be done. The same applies to methane. You know, some of the trials around additives are actually showing reduced weight gain. Once again, that's an adverse impact to productivity and profitability. You're not going to be doing it if that's what's going to happen. So the exciting thing is there is so much research going on around the world, that there's a real opportunity to be able to see what others are doing. You know, I was at UNE, they were saying that to put a bolus in was going to need too much additive into an animal. In New Zealand, I saw boluses that were the same size as what we'd seen previously for grass tetany and bloat. So it's an exciting area to be in. It's moving very fast, and there are great opportunities. And I think it's being able to rely on those in the supply chain that can really help us as producers to actually make a difference. And I think that's why I'm a real strong advocate for letting the marketplace work, because the market's street it's ahead, and the government needs to actually come in and actually enable and work out where the incentives need to be.
Thank you, Sue. We've got a question from Michael Constable. Michael, throw to you.
Hi, I'll just unmute myself. This is probably more a question to Rebecca. I'm just wondering what the potential for sustainability improvement and emissions reduction is achievable through genetically modified crops, and if that's acceptable to the audience that's demanding emissions reductions and sustainability improvements. Thanks.
Yeah, good question, Michael. I guess I see GM crops as the big benefit for those that technology for emissions is around emissions intensity. So those crops will generally, and this is a broad generalization, but they're looking at high yields, or they can they're looking at disease resistance in crops, etc. So they're really looking at that yield gain. And so that's where I see by using a GM crop, and it's not always the case because there's some really good conventionally bred crops as well. But if you can get a GM crop that is showing reduced disease or increased disease tolerance, improved yields, improved quality, but particularly yield, then you are going to see potentially reduced emissions intensity. So I think some of the genetic gains that can be made with cropping systems with GM technology any sort of transgenic crop is going to be really critical down the track. And how is it being perceived by the market? I probably can't comment on that as much. What I would say is I've probably seen a shift. There was a really a voice in the supply chain that wasn't really for GM crops, say 10, 15 years ago, but that's certainly dropped off now. I don't hear that rhetoric much anymore. And certainly probably this sustainability sort of messaging has sort of nearly taken over. So I can't speak for supply chain, but it has seemed to have lost a bit of traction, I think, that GM debate. Sorry, the negative GM debate.
And Michael, I can probably just add something there, only because I heard it at the ANU this morning when I was there, and they were talking about synthetic biology, so SynBio, and it really was about gene editing and GMOs. And I asked them about that because I said, this is really interesting because there is a bit of connotation about GMOs. We see some of that coming from Europe. There are huge gains to be made in terms of both GMOs and gene editing. But is there some sort of contagion going to the community? So I was really interested to hear that they were talking about SynBio as being the exciting cutting edge. And I'm just wondering if that can be a way that we frame it around the really exciting way to get the advancements that we know we can get from, working with gene technology.
Yeah, thanks. One particular example I was thinking of was the development of a C4 variety of rice, which requires a lot less water, which would have obvious, I would have thought, both emissions and sustainability benefits. But again, that's a pretty radical, going from a cereal, a C4 version of a cereal is a pretty radical change, which I would expect the market would be resistant to.
Yeah, and I'd only add to that, Michael, that some of this gene technology has seen crops go into areas that previously, that were considered pretty marginal and weren't cropped regularly. So I think we have seen, that in Australia and other parts of the world. So that, that's a really good thing. So I do see a lot of advancement and a lot of correlation to sustainability, improving sustainability with gene technology, not just necessarily GMO, but gene technology.
Thanks very much.
Well, thanks. That brings us pretty much perfectly to time. We've only run about 3 minutes over. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We're grateful that you did. Know that it's a busy evening time for a lot of families. To all those who are here tonight, please keep an eye on your inbox because we'll keep promoting our webinar series. The next one, we're hearing from Jacob Beatros and Joe McMenamin from MLA regarding the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework and also MLA's Sustainability RD&A priorities. So again, thank you to our wonderful speakers tonight. It's been a privilege to listen to you, and we look forward to what you both get up to in the future. So good night all, and thanks for joining.
So.